Hello class, now we come to the topic of Islam. I like to prepare the ground with a few sources that I like to recommend for you, and also primarily giving you a sense of the relation between Christians and Muslims as we have understood it in history. So if you are a newcomer to Islam, the book that I have used to introduce students, especially in a Christian setting, is this book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. You may have encountered this book before. It was quite widespread. It came out in 2015 or so by Nabil Qureshi. Qureshi is the author of a few other books. I ended up reviewing this one for him. And then this book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, where you get a genuine appreciation for the Islamic worldview as well as the Christian worldview put side by side. Nabil Qureshi was an American-born of Pakistani parents. His father was in the Navy, I believe, and his mother was an exemplary Islamic mother who taught to teach him all the precepts of Islam. And so what you have here is his own conversion story. So this is the most approachable way in which you can begin to understand Islam. It is very narrative-wise. Nabil does an excellent job explaining and keeping you along with the narrative and the questions that came up. So what you have in this book is that you're going to deal with questions that are usually raised regarding Muslims and Christians, and the understanding across culturally, and also things like, well, what about the reliability of the gospel? So what about what do the Muslims say about Jesus, and was he conceived as a prophet? Why not the Son of God? And why do they oppose the Trinity? And what about the Quran and the holiness of the Quran? And so he takes you through a journey. It took him a few years to become a believer, and unfortunately he passed away this last year. I believe this year itself. He had some form of cancer develop, and it just metastasized, and then he lost his life quite rapidly. Very young, young wife, and I'm not sure if he had children, but very unfortunate. In any case, he gave us this book, which I highly recommend it as a way of incorporating and helping you see the difference. How would a Muslim who wants to be a faithful Muslim wrestle with the differences, and what is it that he saw in Christianity that was a turnoff, as well as what is it that his father and mother inculcated in him, which he found so laudable and left such an important imprint into his life. A sequel to this book will be No God But One. Now, the reason why I recommend this book too by Nabil Qureshi is that there is a large literature out there explaining the historical and evidentialist. Now, evidentialism is an apologetical methodology of the arguments that are given for the resurrection of Christ, for the reliability of Scripture, for the historicity of it, and so on. And it tends to be quite a daunting task to be able to deal with all of those proofs that are out there. And here, Nabil Qureshi is going to, who has a very good ability of summarizing and making things comprehensible. He is going to kind of consolidate into this book what he believes to be the essence of the historical disagreement and the theological disagreements. This is not a biographical account, so it doesn't read as pleasantly as Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. In fact, I listened to this one several times. You can get it on Audible, and it is quite a joy. My wife listened to it, and I may not agree with everything that is said there, but I appreciated the genuineness and the way in which the Lord worked in Nabil's life. That's a beauty to see, and see his friend David, who patiently and through good witness and right actions and gaining his trust was able to make headway with Nabil Qureshi. So highly recommended as a first beginning book. This will be a follow-up of it from a Christian perspective. If you are looking more for an academic source that is not overwhelming in nature, but it is accurate and reliable. There was this series of book. It's called the Religious Life of Men. This used to be a textbook, and they have one for Buddhism and one for Hinduism and one for Islam that I highly appreciate and recommend. Very well written, very short, very concise, and very reliable. Far better than the textbooks that you find out there on Islam. And I've been teaching world religions for a few years, and I still go back to this book as a reliable reference on Islam. So, on top of that, I would like to, in the following lecture, discuss this book, which most closely discuss the contentions that are between Christians and Muslims within the Islamic tradition. So it is very typical for Christians to want to speak of the God of Allah and the God of Christianity and Yahweh as simply being they are all theists, they're monotheists, and there is not really much different other than, we believe in the Bible, they believe in the Quran, we believe that Christ is divine, they believe that he's a great prophet. But overall, God is kind of like the same character, same nature. And this book was very much an eye-opener for me. It was very helpful in putting things together. Robert Riley did this book. And you owe it to Riley to read it through, at least the first half. The other half is him trying to respond to it in his own Aristotelian Thomistic way. But the most of this book is just very much worth the time reading, and I will go into it in the second lecture. The most important figure, and that will come out of this book, the most important figure in the history of Islam is Al-Ghazali. And Al-Ghazali did us a favor, and it's a very short book. I found it at a yard sale. That was one of my treasures that I found there for like $1. This tended to be quite an expensive book. But it is The Path to Sufism. He is the founder of Islamic Orthodoxy. He will be the head of what's called the Asharite tradition in Islam. And he puts down his thoughts as to what he believes to be the truth and maxims of Islam. Very much recommended. He will be like your Thomas Aquinas for the Roman Catholics, or your John Calvin for Reform, or Martin Luther for the Lutherans. So he will be a point of beginning. So when we approach Islam, Islam arose in the 600s, 610, of course, under the Prophet Muhammad, and he claimed to have received revelation from Allah regarding the divine nature, and then the giving of the Quran. And Islam believes that Christianity and Judaism both err by manipulating and changing the content of divine revelation. And so what we have as a Torah and the Old Testament and the New Testament are but deeply and grievous distortions of the reality of God. In fact, for an ordinary historic Muslim, the worst distortion that you can possibly make about the divine nature is to believe that he came in human form. And that he walked among us, and that also that we are made in his image. That is kind of like the apex of idolatry in their eyes. Now, by this, I'm talking about those who are historically acquainted, not your popularly acquainted Muslim, but those in the tradition of Islam that have studied and understood the ideas. To believe that humankind is made in the image of God, it's the highest expression of narcissistic self-flattering that we have engaged in. To say that we share in the same identity as God, and the same nature as God, and the same image as Him, it is terrifying to a Muslim to say that God came in the flesh, and He dwelt among us. That he condescended to partake in human affairs. It's again the worst kind of expression of idolatry that you may have. So there are theological issues that have been there in Islam and Christianity from its beginning, its inception. There are misunderstandings that Islam has regarding Christianity. For example, Muslims believe that the Trinity is God the Father, God the Son, and Mary. They believe that Jesus was conceived by sexual intercourse. That's how they portray it, um, and of course those are caricatures of what we believe about our Lord and the immaculate conception, uh, or the fact that it was a miracle, not sexual intercourse, and then there are also historical misunderstandings and grievances that have aggravated this. The best author that I have found, and unfortunately I looked for it but I could not find it. It's a very reliable. He is the most authoritative person or researcher in Islam. He began research in Islam in the 1930s before anybody had any interest in the Middle East besides, of course, British petroleums when they began to develop their search in the 1920s and 30s. But Bernard Lewis has been studying Islam. I believe he's still alive today. He must be about 90 years old. He wrote a few books that are for public consumption for you and me and others that are not scholarly in its narrow sense. He's been writing, of course, for decades and decades. He's I believe, either Oxford or Cambridge professor. He's just, a classical don of intellectuals. But he is he has a very good judgment and tries to be very objective and still holds on to that modernist tradition that we can attain the truth if we have the relevant facts. And he wrote a few books that are going to be very consequential. One of them is called The Crisis of Islam, and that one is his condensed version of what has gone wrong with Islam. What kind of challenges are they dealing with? How do they see the West? How do they see Christians? How do they see their role in history? How do they account for the backwardness and the violence that exists? Now, that's a very short book. I believe the audio book is about 3.5 hours. Definitely a sit down, read it through. You will glean a lot of good information from it. He also has another book which it was one of my delights to read that book, because it was a historical account of the relations between Muslims and Christians over the last 1400 years. But he's trying to tackle a question, and the question is, what went wrong? That is the actual title of the book. And what he does there is explains what has happened in the last 1400 years, but also how have the Muslims, who used to be the apex of human civilization, and they were, while Europe was going through the quote-unquote dark ages, Islam arose, and by 750, I believe 632, Muhammad died. By 750, they had a big an empire than the Roman Empire was at its height, and then from then on they continued on until the Mongolian invasions, and then they recovered from that. I believe it was 1258, and then they began to expand again, and of course they took over Constantinople and became Istanbul, and then they became the Ottoman Empire, which lasted until the end of World War I. But they used to be the leading researchers. They used to have the greatest expression of science and philosophy and theology, and that's what you're going to see in this other book. And they ruled the world. I mean, Europe was completely backwards, but then all of a sudden by 1500, Europe begins this acceleration, and they begin with colonization and scientific discoveries and literature and the printing press and the Reformation and the Industrial Revolution and the Technological Revolution and the Informational Age, and then development in weapons and all sorts of things. And the Muslims find themselves absolutely and completely baffled. How did this happen to us? What did we do wrong? Who is responsible for this? And he covers those issues in a very short book as well. That book, What Went Wrong, I highly recommend it for you, to give you a narrative of how they interpret their current circumstance, and you can see the deep frustrations and inability to reckon with the modern world, and how Islam continues to go deeper and deeper in his use of violence because he doesn't know how to respond in other ways at this time. So I'll stop there and then go over the other book. Bye.